understand and appreciate the history of the Balls Mills United Methodist Church, one must first look at the community in which the church was founded. As with many farming communities taking shape across the new land, the origins of Balls Mills begins over 200 years ago. In 1803, Samuel Carpenter settled where Warrensville now stands and built a grain mill. Other farming families soon recognized the potential of the Susquehanna Valley. In the fall of 1805, George Weasel moved his family and settled in the area now known as Eldred Township. Shortly after his arrival, he purchased a small tract of land in Hepburn Township and proceeded to build a homestead. That winter, he cut a road through the woods, and in the spring of 1806 he moved his family into the new home. In the year 1808, he erected a new mill on the banks of Mill Creek, and 2 years later began building a grist mill. William Ball, a brother-in-law of Mr. Weasel, moved to the area soon afterwards and was an apprentice at the grist mill, which was completed in the fall of 1810. Eventually, William Ball became owner of the mill. In 1818, he settled on 880 acres in Hepburn Township and began building his home. This was followed by the building of a woolen mill and a clover mill. As the business grew, others migrated to the area and settled in a small community along Mill Creek. The community became known as Balls Mills. It was actually William Ball's father, John Ball, for whom the town of Balls Mills was named. John Ball, who emigrated from England in 1793, had settled in Hillsgrove Township, where he had built a sawmill and was beginning to have success when he tragically drowned while bathing. In 1840, William Ball built a sawmill for his oldest son Isaac along Mill Run in the growing community of Balls Mills. All of the present-day Balls Mills area was actually part of the Isaac Ball farm. The original sawmill and grist mill were run by water power at the time. The grist mill made the wheat flour and was 4 stories tall. The basement was used for storage. The second floor is where George Burr made the bushel crates. He also raised rabbits on the second floor. The third floor housed grinding stones. Customers never really paid money to have their grain ground by George, but he took what was called a toll to help provide feed for his animals. Wayne Stebbins remembers.
The old grist mill was still in operation when my family moved to Balls Mills in 1949. The overshot water wheel was long gone, but the flume tower that replaced it was still standing. The flume tower was about 30 to 35 feet high and provided a vertical drop for the water that ran a water turbine, which in turn ran the gears that put the mill into action. By 1949, the mill was powered by a 1941 John Deere tractor, which also ran the cider press, which was attached to the mill. The primary use of the mill was to grind chop for cattle. When I was growing up, especially in my teen years and beyond, I helped grind chop at the mill and press cider. I remember the cider press was dismantled in the early 1990s and moved to Canada, where it may still be in operation. The mill was more than a place to grind chop, store corn, or press cider. It was also a place of mystery and a place of fun on many occasions. You could access the building through numerous openings. You could climb the flume tower on the outside and enter any floor you desired. You could climb up the corn grinder chute from the ground floor to the first floor, or climb up the cider press and enter the first floor through the pulley opening. In our games of adventure, the adversary never knew from what direction you might appear. Probably the most amazing thing about all of this is that none of us ever fell or were injured in our mill escapades. You could remain hidden even when you entered a floor from the various approaches. On occasion, we did enter the mill by the front door, which faced Route 973. Of special interest, even in our younger days, was the wall of the mill office that was on our right side as we entered the building. On that wall was a poster about 10 feet wide and at least 5 or 6 feet high that advertised the coming to town of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. The poster showed buffalo, cowboys, Indians, fancy horses, a stagecoach, and of course Buffalo Bill. As we would have said in those days, that was really neat. When the mill was torn down in the 1970s, that wall was purchased and carefully removed for transport to its new location. Unfortunately, I never did ask where it was going. Like the cider press, however, it is good to know that it has a new home. The old grist mill is no longer in Balls Mills. Asian weather and lack of repair took its toll, and public safety necessitated its removal. The site upon which the mill, cider press, and sawmill sat is now occupied Janway Company. The stone walls in front of this building were built from the foundation stones of the old grist mill. The wooden gear that is displayed there used to drive one of the grindstones. Although the original buildings are gone, the old grist mill lives on in the memories of those who found it, a place of adventure, or may have worked there or just passed the time sipping cider, waiting for their chopped grain. I know a lot of people beside me would like to thank those who came before us, who were kind enough to build a marvelous palace of fun and adventure for our enjoyment.
Another son, Samuel, who was born in 1821, began making grain cradles in 1847, and within 20 years he had built a cradle factory and was shipping his unique style of grain cradles throughout the country. Mr. Ball used an ordinary scythe and placed 4 spaced wooden fingers above the cutting blade, which would be used to cut and carry grain, which would be easily raked up into sheaves or bundles. This simple cradle reduced harvest so quickly that it was said 2 strong men could harvest as much grain in a day with a cradle and rake as a dozen men with any other method. The grain cradle was eventually replaced with the McCormick combine, but if you travel throughout the country, you will still find the Samuel Ball grain cradle at various farm museums. Not only is there one in the Dunkard Church Museum, but if your travels take you to our nation's capital, one still resides in the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of History and Technology. A long-standing tradition dates back to the turn of the century. At cider-making time, wagons with as many as 50 bushels of apples would arrive at George Burr's cider press before daylight. Sometimes the line would be 15 to 25 wagons long, which meant a long wait for the last wagon in line. Some of the cider would be kept for vinegar, but most of it was used to make apple butter, a tradition still carried on today using the old-time way. Over an open fire in a copper-lined kettle and a long-handled stirrer. Roscoe Heim recalled, "I always loved to go along to the apple press, although I was very young at the time. As we would pass Adderholds and start down the hill, you could see the lanterns on the wagons ahead of us, usually 5 or 6. When it was our turn, Dad would back the wagon up to the press, unload the barrels of apples we picked, get his scoop shovel and begin to scoop apples into the hopper that was connected to an elevator. The elevator would take the apples up to a grinder. From there they would fall onto large cheesecloth sheets and would be pressed. If you didn't have enough barrels to hold all your cider, George always had one handy. He used this as a tonic for the coming year. I'm told that one time he got a little too much of the tonic and fell into the pit where the 20-foot waterfall was located. If it hadn't been for Mr. Brooklocker, the blacksmith, pulling him out, he'd still be there today. Around the same time, we would usually make apple butter. The original log house on our farm had a huge fireplace to boil apple butter. I remember one particular time when the apple butter was ready to put in gallon crocks. A bird's nest fell loose from the chimney and came down smack dab in the middle of the kettle. Can't you just imagine how Mom and Dad felt as they dumped that kettle of apple butter out in the field? As with most farming communities, Balls Mills residents had a deep belief in God and in all the bounties that He would provide. The early religious movement of the area was rooted as a German-speaking congregation of the Evangelical Church founded by Jacob Albright. When difficulties arose within the denomination, Balls Mills cast its lot with the United Evangelical Church, and in 1946 it merged with the United Brethren Church. From that time until the merger with the Methodist Church in 1968, the congregation was known as the Balls Mills Evangelical United Brethren Church, a reminder of which is the stained glass window over the front entrance. Founders of this congregation were of German origin. Many of them arrived from the Palatinate region of Germany. They came to America and thence to this area to escape religious persecution and the devastation of their farms due to the separatist movement from 1848 to 1871. Naturally, they welcomed German-speaking ministers and gave a ready ear to evangelical circuit riders who could preach in their native tongue. It was this bond of language that made the Blooming Grove area a fruitful field of early evangelical labor and led to the forming of a class at Balls Mills in 1860 and the building of a house of worship in 1867. The Balls Mills congregation has always been associated with other preaching appointments. Collectively, these have constituted a circuit. While the Balls Mills class as an organized congregation dates to 1860, there was an evangelical preaching in the Balls Mills area much earlier. From 1830 to 1877, the area was part of the old Lycoming circuit. During these years, there were 19 to 24 preaching places, and usually 2 circuit riders in the field. From 1877 to 1897, Balls Mills, along with Crescent, Rose Valley, Warrensville, Loyalsockville, Fairview, Fasner's, and Osborne Schoolhouse comprised the Williamsport circuit. From 1897 to 1901, Balls Mills was combined with Grace Church in South Williamsport and Eagle Church to form a newly defined Williamsport circuit. Eventually, Grace Church was detached, and the circuit and Heshbon and Quaker Hill were added, and eventually removed. In 1958, only Balls Mills and Eagle composed a circuit. The circuit rider preached wherever opportunity presented itself. A Methodist preacher, when he felt that God had called him to preach, instead of hunting up a college or biblical institute, hunted up a hardy pony and some traveling apparatus, and with his library always at hand, namely a Bible, hymn book, and discipline, he started, and with a text that never wore out nor grew stale, he cried, "Behold, the Lamb of God, that taketh away the sin of the world." In this way he went through storms of wind, hail, snow, and rain, climbed hills and mountains, traversed valleys, plunged through swamps, swollen streams, lay out all night, wet, weary, and hungry, held his horse by the bridle all night, or tied him to a limb, slept with his saddle blanket for a bed, his saddlebags for a pillow. Often he slept in dirty cabins, ate roasting ears for bread, drank buttermilk for coffee, took deer or bear meat or wild turkey for breakfast, dinner, and supper. This was old-fashioned Methodist preacher fare and fortune. Peter Cartwright, 1860. They went into private homes and schoolhouses. They were quick to visit camp meetings and would travel many miles to participate in bush meetings. These camp meetings comprised of hearty singing and protracted prayers. They were normally held in wooded groves, a tradition that's still maintained today at nearby Stabler's Grove.
Although 1860 marks the official organization date of the Balls Mills class, the first house of worship wasn't built until 1867. The deed of record shows the transfer of 1/8 acre of land by Isaac Ball and wife to the trustees of the Balls Mills congregation. A second deed covers a half-acre plot adjoining the church on the south. It was purchased for a graveyard and is today the resting place of many of the church's earliest members. An historical sketch dated 1932 indicates Isaac Ball donated the land for the church with the understanding that he was to be awarded the contract to build it. He did receive the contract with his bid of $1,000. Churches at that time were simple structures. The frame church at the end of town was no exception. It reflected the modesty and frugality of its German members. One new member of the community described the church saying,
"Was as plain as the outside was unpretentious." Mrs. Daniel Snyder, 1867.
The windows were clear glass without ornamentation. Illumination was provided by kerosene lamps, the largest of which hung from the ceiling in the center of the room and could be pulled down or raised by a pulley arrangement. Smaller lamps were placed in brackets along the walls. 2 stoves provided heat, one on each side of the room, midway between the doors in the rear and the pulpit in the front. On extremely cold Sundays, those arriving for services late had to sit at chilly distances in the rear. There was an aisle in the front of each stove and pews around the 3 sides. The middle section of the room was occupied by long rows of straight-backed pews with a divider down the center. The church faced west. In front was a small yard enclosed by a fence with a single gate. There was no mingling once inside the fence. As was the custom of the time, men and boys used one entrance and women and girls used the other. Families did not sit together. Women and girls sat on the north side of the aisle, and the men and the boys sat on the south side. While the church boasted no finery, those who worshiped in it did not neglect the practical things. They placed oilcloths under the stoves and under spittoons, which were arranged at strategic points on the men's side and in the pulpit. The church stood unchanged until 1883. In that year, it was extensively renovated. The work would cost a resounding $400. Since there was only $175 in the treasury, the extra money needed to be raised. During the reopening service, the passing of the plate commenced with the intent to collect enough money to immediately pay off the debt.
In about 45 minutes, we secured the whole amount, with some despair amid the gladness of all present. The church, since its overhauling, takes on quite an improved appearance. It received a new coat of paint outside and inside. The walls are beautifully papered, a new chandelier hangs in the center, and 2 fine hanging lamps are in front of the pulpit. It has new carpet in the altar, new matting in the aisles, and a neat arrangement for the choir. Taking all in all, if the people of Balls Mills do not advance in piety, it is not because they have no place comfortable enough to worship. What we now need is an old-fashioned revival of religion. Reverend C. H. Goodling, 1883.
By the end of the century, a vestibule and belfry were added to the west end of the building and extension made to the east. A partial basement was excavated to permit installation of a furnace. While the work was in progress, services were held at the nearby schoolhouse. Rededication services were held on June 27, 1897. In that year, a 99-year lease was negotiated for use of the land just east of the church. 2 years later, a near catastrophe occurred at the church. As reported in the March 21, 1899 Williamsport Sun newspaper under the headline, "Congregation Put to Sleep," the following article appeared.
Gas affects the good people of Balls Mills. An unusual scene occurred at the United Evangelical Church at Balls Mills during the services Sunday morning, when the entire congregation assembled there was affected by gas which escaped from the heater in the basement of the building. Church members Floyd Muchler, Sherman Muchler, Ella Roos, Mary Snyder, and Ora Snyder were seriously affected. As others fainted, Reverend Charles Soanes immediately closed the service, thus averting the loss of life by asphyxiation. Dr. William Howell of Cogan Station was at once summoned and said that several of the cases were very serious. If the congregation had remained in the church several minutes longer, the result might have been fatal in some cases.
No records of what caused the escaping gas were ever reported.
At the turn of the century, Balls Mills was a busy place for a small village in the foothills of the mountain just north of Williamsport. The growth of the lumber industry in Williamsport would rub off on this small community. Even Samuel Ball's grain cradle factory, built in 1867, was still in business. Although the various mills are long gone, the farmhouse and barn can still be seen along 973 East. Samuel Ball set the example of community service for his employees as he helped to build the first local school building. As families moved into the area, names like Waltz, Ulmer, and Stabler began to take root. In the village of Balls Mills, Andy Danler had a blacksmith shop. William Spotts was a butcher and kept a store. Starting in 1888, the building also housed the post office called Hepburn. Before the local post office, mail had to be retrieved in Williamsport, often only once a week. The post office building no longer stands. It was located next to the Naval Academy building. The Naval Academy building was used as a polling place. Later, it was used by David Lehman as a storage room and eventually donated to the church. Next to Gottlieb Kurtz's small store was a shop used for wagon making. Fred Klump and James Ulmer were wagon makers. After serving as an apprentice, Charlie Brooklocker would take over the blacksmith shop and would continue to operate the shop into the 1950s. At the turn of the century, Charlie and his wife would welcome the birth of their second daughter, Ruth. David Lehman was the school teacher for almost 40 years. This picture from the class of 1908 shows many of the descendants of the current congregation. Names like Snyder, Hyde, Bauer, Keese, Seitzer, Lehman, Blair, Muchler, and Miller are represented. David Lehman eventually bought the William Spotts store property and built and ran a new store on the property after retiring from teaching. He and his wife Carrie would soon welcome a new daughter, naming her Sarah. The store was located on one side of the building and the family lived on the other side.
Many youth church camps were available where we learned teaching, social, and church leadership skills. Our youth were active in promoting these skills in our county, district, and home churches. Our entire life revolved around our Christian homes, church activities, and public schools. Nelson Livermore.
Church life consisted mostly of Sunday school and church on Sundays, with an occasional 1 or 2 week winter revival meeting, a summer camp meeting ministries in Adderholds Grove, a Sunday school picnic, and an occasional church festival. The annual Grove meeting, or as the kids called it, the Bush meeting, was held annually at Mock Hollow. There, a large pavilion built by the men of Balls Mills Church provided adequate space for the pulpit, a small choir, a piano, and a backless bench on which visiting clergy were seated. Benches for the congregation were made up of 2x10 planks, resting on logs which held the planks about a foot above the ground. There were no backrests provided, and so comfort was at a minimum. The meetings began on Sunday and continued through the following Sunday, usually a service marked by lots of good music and a longer sermon by a guest preacher. A Grove meeting was a family event, long anticipated and long reflected upon. A special event was always the Sunday school picnic. Also held at Adderholds Grove, families began arriving mid-afternoon and group activities were planned for all ages. Games for children, a ball game for teenagers, and horseshoes for the adult men. Meanwhile, the women busied themselves unpacking picnic baskets and chatting noisily as they prepared the tables for dinner to come. Roscoe Heim remembers, when the dinner bell was sounded, most everyone made a beeline for the 10-gallon lemonade tub. A large chunk of ice made the beverage especially refreshing after a sweaty hour of games. By day's end, the tub was always empty. A favorite activity for the youngsters was the peanut scramble, or perhaps a three-legged race. The parents made good use of time by catching up on neighborhood news. The teenage girls usually went for a walk, while the boys headed for the ball field. Supper was served promptly at 5 o'clock, after which the families made a hasty exodus to begin the evening farm chores. After chore time, the young folks would return to the grove for their annual watermelon party. The boys busied themselves gathering wood for a giant bonfire. Then came more games, such as Happy Johnny Miller. Fortunately, we had discovered that rock music and drugs were not necessary ingredients of a good time. After plenty of good, clean fun, we would cut the watermelon. For those whose taste called for hot dogs, they were in plenty supply. Thus, a perfect evening brought to a close what this farm boy thought would be a perfect day. The other special event was the church festival. This was held in a shed behind the old Balls Mills Church, which ordinarily was occupied by horses during Sunday services or Wednesday night prayer meeting. For those lucky enough, a quarter would buy a youngster an ice cream cone, a bottle of soft drink, and a large bag of peanuts. With the nickel left over, they could enter the cakewalk. The Sunday school program grew first and fast. Ministers conducted teacher training classes and taught students how to hold meaningful discussions. He often preached sermons that supported the Sunday school lesson subject matter, which helped to understand the difficult teachings of the Bible. Students were taught the importance of Sunday school as a supporting arm of the church, and thus encouraged membership with its vows and covenants. Through the turn of the new century, the congregation grew steadily and would eventually outgrow the old frame church. There were 29 farm families and 5 non-farm families that belonged to and attended the old church. A building fund was started in 1922, and the land was purchased on March 1, 1932. It became obvious that a larger church with room for Sunday school programs was necessary. Plans were drawn up for a 48 by 72-foot structure. Newspaper accounts of the groundbreaking say that Matthias Muchler, then 86 and a charter member of the congregation, turned the first shovel. Afterward, in turn, the shovel was passed to the pastor, to the presiding elder Walter Dice, Fred Blair, Sherman Muchler, Mrs. Mary Smith, Mrs. David Lehman, Mrs. Mary Hyde, Mrs. Charles Brooklocker, Mrs. Ezra Heim, Mrs. Maria Ulmer, and finally to Greta Chamberlain, a child of 4.
Nelson Livermore recalls,
The farm fathers dug the cellar for the new church with horse-drawn hand dump scoops. We younger boys and our fathers hauled stones from the creek nearby with horse and wagon into the cellar for the older boys and men to break into smaller pieces instead of gravel for under the concrete floor. Much of the work was donated by the church members in 1932 when the church was dedicated. Electricity was only available on Route 15 north and east on 973 to Balls Mills. Other areas nearby didn't receive electric service as late as 1945.
One of the irritating problems was a water supply. This problem was finally resolved by drilling an artesian well in the basement. As described in the local paper, an artesian well with a flow of 11 3/4 gallons a minute will furnish water for the new Balls Mills Evangelical Church. The water was struck after 125 feet of very hard rock had been penetrated. The rock layer was encountered when the drill was only 6 feet beneath the surface of the ground. On the afternoon of Sunday, July 24, 1932, the cornerstone for the new church was laid. Persons attending and contributing $1 or more to the building fund had their names enrolled on a scroll which was placed in the cornerstone where it resides to this day. It contains about 100 names. It was reported the new church was of brick and tile trimmed in cast stone, and that it was built for $21,300. Of this, $15,000 had been paid by dedication day. In spite of the trying Depression years of the 1930s, the congregation was so faithful in its stewardship that it was able to liquidate the debt of the new church by September 30th, 1941. It was appropriate that Mrs. Maggie Seitzer and Melvin Ressler, the oldest and youngest members of the congregation, had part in the burning of the church mortgage. Construction moved along without delay, and the dedication service was held on Sunday, December 4th, 1932, with Bishop Mays officiating. The dedication ceremonies started at the frame church. Members assembled at 9:25 a.m., and a brief service of song and prayer was conducted. After fervent and touching prayers, a sad farewell was bid to the old church, and the assembly proudly marched from it to the new brick church. I remember that the three oldest members of the congregation, Matthias Mutchler, Mrs. Jane Hensler, and Mrs. Anna Fry, led the procession. Bishop Mays, 1932. After the war, and over a short period of time, the church family doubled in attendance and membership. An adult fellowship social group was soon created. This consisted of a night out once a month for all married couples in the church and community, with babysitters furnished by the church membership. These activities included hay rides, scavenger hunts, swimming parties, and roller skating. As a result, many church members began to socialize in small fellowship groups. Another fellowship group at the time was the Mite Society. Taking their name and mission from the widow's mite story in Mark chapter 12, this group of church members wanting to contribute just a little bit more to help meet the expenses of the church. Both men and women of the church were involved and met monthly. They paid their dues and sponsored many functions, which produced additional income for the church. Their labors produced the annual Easter ham and egg suppers, bazaars, festivals, and harvest home services. They also presented one of the colorful windows in the old educational section of the church. The facilities of the new church were improved in 1946 through the installation of a Hammond electric organ. It was a gift of David Lehman, one of the most faithful members of the congregation, and was presented as a memorial to his wife, Carrie Schaefer Lehman. Upon the death of Mr. Lehman in 1958, an endowment of $1,000 was paid from his estate to the trustees for maintenance of the organ. In 1949, the church was repainted and recarpeted at a cost of a little over $4,300. A rededication service was conducted under the pastorate of Reverend Harold Springman. Music was provided by two organists, Mrs. Arden Mutchler, who would retire in 1958 after providing 47 years volunteer service as church organist, and Mrs. Clarence Snyder, who would retire in 1974 having given over 55 years of faithful service to the church. As the church grew in membership, the social hall was remodeled and a new kitchen area was added to the basement of the church. In October 1960, a week-long celebration was held to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the congregation. The observance began with a communion service and continued with special nightly services including missionary night, neighbor night, youth fellowship night, and climaxed with homecoming service, in which many pastors who had formerly served at Balls Mills participated in the celebration. The first parsonage supporting the Balls Mills ministry was provided for the Williamsport Circuit and was built in 1900 across from Eagle Church. In early spring of 1962, 2 years after the church's centennial celebration, ground was broken for the current parsonage. On September 9, 1962, a service of dedication of the parsonage was conducted with the Reverend Steely officiating. Pastor and Mrs. Newcomer welcomed everyone to the open house event. A sign of the times was that the final construction cost for the 56 by 29 foot ranch parsonage was $25,560, or $4,000 more than the church itself had cost 3 decades earlier. As was the custom, payment was completed that same year with the final amount of $1,848 coming on behalf of a rally day. As in the past, the church of Balls Mills recognized it had a need for more room, but hesitated about the commitment that a building program requires. In 1984, with only $8,000 in available funding, the church trustees named a long-range planning committee to begin the expansion process. The needs for an addition was presented, studied, and the following areas were itemized as important to the growth of Balls Mills Church. Items such as space for 6 or 7 more Sunday school classes, a church office, wheelchair accessibility, and room for future growth were defined as goals. In November 1985, and after much deliberation, 3 proposals were considered. The first proposal was a 1-story building. Proposal number 2 was a 1-story building with a flat roof that could be expanded into a 2nd floor. The third and successful proposal was the most aggressive and the costliest. This proposal called for a 2-story building. After seeking consideration through the Stewardship and Finance Committee and the Administration Board, a new building committee was formed to define and deliberate on specific building decisions. Such items as folding partitions, types of windows, heating systems, etc. fell under this committee. Architectural drawings were eventually made. A separate treasury account was established strictly for the building finances. Merlin Johnson accepted the position of Building Finance Treasurer, which he would hold throughout the construction phase. Bids were submitted, and the committee accepted Schoen Builders' bid of $236,000 with a proposed starting date of spring 1988. In May 1987, Charge Conference approved the plans. The time between the approval of the plans and the breaking ground called for serious fundraising. Around $72,000 was donated before groundbreaking, which occurred on March 13, 1988. Work progressed through the spring and summer months. As the fall season approached, much of the interior work, such as painting, was done by church members. Dedication was conducted on October 30, 1988. As illustrated previously with the frame church and the brick church, members of the congregation gave lovingly to help pay off the mortgage. The popular Balls Mills ice cream festivals saw a new tradition in the form of the Harvest Fair, in which many of the proceeds went to help pay down the mortgage. Within a few short years, Pastor James Sunderland led the congregation in the mortgage burning celebration, which was conducted on May 23, 1999. In June 1990, the church received a grant from the conference in the amount of $4,500 to renovate the balcony area to allow for additional seating. Within the monetary limits, trustees decided to do the work largely within the talents of the congregation. Interior windows and partitions were removed or re-engineered, and lighting was added. As the year 2000 was approaching, a new fund drive was issued for the purchase of a new church organ. The original organ dated back to 1946, and through the generosity of the David Lehman estate, money was available for annual upkeep. However, as the organ got older, it became more difficult and expensive to maintain. Replacement parts were scarce. An organ replacement committee was formed, and a unique fund drive was initiated in which a keyboard sign was created. Members of the congregation and church-sponsored groups could purchase a key for $50 or $100 each. With the help of a large donation, money became available, and the committee began visiting local churches which had made similar purchases. The decision was made to purchase the new Allen organ for a cost of approximately $15,000, and upon installation, the congregation was treated to a dedication performance by a representative from Robert M. Sides. Items such as ceiling fans, enhanced lighting, carpet replacement, and new glass doors in the narthex have all been added in recent years. The addition of the new sound system has greatly improved the worship experience. The new sound system not only has been an improvement to the sound aspects of worship, but has opened new areas of opportunity for music and youth ministries. The system also has the capacity to provide devices to enhance the worship experience for the hearing impaired and has improved the quality of recording of the service for those homebound members of our congregation. Even within the educational wing, the trustees have continued to improve the facilities through the renovations to the nursery and the expansion of the kitchen area upstairs. In the summer of 1999, the church trustees voted to start a memorial garden after receiving numerous requests from members of the congregation to plant a tree or shrub in honor or memory of a loved one or friend. Engraved stones mark the name of the honored or memorialized person. Today, the Balls Mills United Methodist Church not only stands as a house of worship and Christian learning, but also provides a place for community and social gathering. Quilting has been done in the Balls Mills area for generations. Women met in various homes and all ages participated. Children would gather and play under the quilts while their mothers stitched. A meal would be served after they finished quilting for the day, then they would return home. Many of the homes had a quilting frame, so the quilt would be removed and taken to the next home for the next quilting session. Soon after the brick church was completed, the women began quilting there. Today, the quilting tradition is carried on by a new generation of quilters, many of whom come from miles away because they just love to quilt and enjoy the friendliness of the Balls Mills women. For many years, Balls Mills has also been the home of Boy Scout Troop 36 and Cub Pack 36. Through the cleanup of the church cemetery in preparation for Easter sunrise services, to various community service activities, the boys have been active. Over those years, Balls Mills has seen dozens of boys achieve the rank of Eagle Scout. The sign in front of the social hall and the flagpole at the parsonage are just two of the various Eagle Scout projects associated with the Scouts from Balls Mills. Over the years, the church has also sponsored a local Girl Scout troop. Through various beautification efforts around the church and the participation in various activities, the local troop has continued to promote the Girl Scout mission of a program to build girls of courage, confidence, and character who make the world a better place. Not to be overlooked is the church's involvement in the John Bower League, the namesake of the oldest and largest church league in America. Whether it involves the midgets who are just learning the game all the way up to the seniors, Balls Mills has always been well represented in talent, integrity, and sportsmanship. Perhaps the strongest youth program is the church youth group. This group of young members and dedicated leaders has taken the book of Acts to heart with their dedicated acts of service. Whether it is helping out at feeding the needy at the local Sojourner Truth Ministry, raking leaves and performing fall cleanup for members of the congregation, or providing a helping hand in communities such as Gulfport, Mississippi and Gary, West Virginia, the Balls Mills Youth Group has been there. Each year the group participates in Cardboard Country, which gives the youth a sense of what it feels like to be lacking in the luxuries that we all share. Youth Group is also a time of fellowship and fun. Through movie night and various retreats, the Youth Group program provides a great alternative for today's local youth. A simple hand-lettered sign on the front of a vacant, one-room, one-story, unpainted frame building in Balls Mills never fails to catch the eye of persons motoring through the village located 4 miles north of Williamsport. It is easily read and probably has excited more curiosity and caused more comment than any other seen there. It reads, "The Balls Mills Naval Academy." This startles strangers who see no apparent evidence of maritime activity except for the gentle flow of water caused by Mill Creek, located less than 50 feet away. So much for the sign. Nobody seems to remember who painted it. There are residents, however, who recall that years ago, when the building was in better shape, it was used as the polling place for Hepburn Township. The story of the Balls Mills Naval Academy is over 100 years old. Legend tells that at the turn of the 20th century, John Philip Lehman owned a hilltop farm 1/2 mile outside of Balls Mills. His eldest daughter, Mary, was married to John Gilmore, an elementary school principal in Williamsport. They had 8 sons, all of whom spent their summers and many weekends helping Grandpap Lehman on the farm. One of the sons, Morris D. Gilmore, received an official congressional appointment to the U.S. Naval Academy. He spent 4 years as a midshipman and graduated in 1911. He served as a submarine commander in World War I, winning the Navy Cross. Now, during his tenure at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, young Morris would learn the ways of the world. However, each summer he would return home and spend considerable time at his grandfather's farm. The story goes that the local boys would grow tired of hearing Morris Gilmore's successes and were quick to deflate their midshipman friend's ego. When Morris would start to forget where his roots were, the local boys would re-educate him by referring to their trips to the farm as visiting the Balls Mills Naval Academy. This soon became a joke continued by succeeding generations. The Balls Mills Naval Academy idea was embraced by the students at the Balls Mills School, and they began referring to their school as the Academy. In turn, some adults began picking up on this idea when Charlie Logue, a reporter for the Williamsport Gazette and Bulletin, got hold of it. Charlie, better known as David of Happy Valley, was able to promote the story. Thus, the Balls Mills Naval Academy was launched into the waves of local folklore. For most of the century, the Academy prospered or suffered from various surges and declines in the enrollment of ardent supporters. The latest period of interest in its continuation and development began in the early 1970s with the creation of an Academy logo by Jim and Paul Ertl. The legacy of the Balls Mills Naval Academy continues to this day through the church. Coffee mugs, sweatshirts, t-shirts, hats, and other items usually bring a smile to the face of those receiving a gift depicting the Schooner on Wheels logo associated with the Naval Academy. Our statement of Christian commitment for this generation would include praises to God for our having been raised in the Christian environment created and supported by our Balls Mills church family for a lifetime of dedicated spiritual enrichment. We are proud to identify our generation's desire to build upon our ancestors' Christian virtues from biblical teachings of continuity. We remember and are thankful for those dedicated followers of Christ. We pray that our generation's efforts to continue to build upon what they started will be found worthy in God's sight. The goal in creating this presentation was to entertain and enlighten those present in understanding the history of the Balls Mills United Methodist Church. By definition, history is the total sum of events that took place before the present. History cannot be changed, nor should it be changed. We need to understand that God has given us the ability to learn from history and understand that it affects everything we do and everything we are. Nothing we do can change the past, but everything we do changes the future. Ashley Brilliant. We thank the following for their contributions, whether it was through the use of pictures, stories, or prayers: Blooming Grove Historical Society, Tabor Museum, Charles Davis, Roscoe Heim, Nelson Livermore, Wayne Stebbins, and of course all of the members of the congregation who have contributed their pictures to the Historical Committee. Thank you.